Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's edition of the CPHI webinar series, where we are presenting the Pharma Trend Outlook for 2021. We have three fantastic speakers taking part today, bringing expertise from leading market intelligence organizations to outline the key trends and developments we can expect to see in pharma in the coming year. This webinar will last around 60 minutes. We have a sequence of 3 presentations followed by a speaker Q&A. Please feel free to submit your questions throughout the webinar. You can do this by typing your question into the Q&A box on the Zoom control panel, which should be at the bottom of your screen. If you'd like to direct a question to a specific speaker, please indicate this. We'll get through as many questions as possible today. So now we can get started. I'd like to introduce our first presenter, Daniel Chancellor, Thought Leadership Director at Informa Pharma Intelligence. Daniel has a decade of experience as an analyst in the biopharma industry, spanning roles in drug discovery, market analysis, competitive intelligence, and strategic consulting. He now develops and leads Informa Pharma Intelligence's Thought Leadership Program, producing materials that help clients across a range of hot topics in the biopharma industry. Most recently, including COVID-19, immuno-oncology, tumor-agnostic drug development, artificial intelligence, and M&A. So over to you, Dan.
Hello, everyone. Sorry about that. Just wrestling with the controls just for a moment. Thank you very much for the introduction, Tara. So as she says, I'm part of Informa Pharma Intelligence, and I'm actually going to be teeing off the presentation by, rather than thinking about the 2021 trends, but actually a bit of context. So I'm going to start by thinking, well, where is the industry now, just before the pandemic hit? And then also thinking about the COVID-19 effect. So what are some of the changes that the industry is going to go through as a result of the pandemic? Okay. Sorry, just wrestling with controls. Okay, so by any number of measures, the industry today, or at the turn of the year, was in a very, very good position. In rude health, you could say, whether you're looking at the size of the R&D pipeline, numbers of clinical trials, deal-making activity, and also prescription sales. I'm going to be going through a few of these in turn and just kind of describing some of the situations that we're seeing. And starting first with R&D measures and the pipeline. The pipeline is very much the industry, or the engine of our industry, that kind of projects it into the future. And this year in particular has been a really interesting one. 10% growth in industry's collective pipeline, and this 10% growth rate is exceeding previous years, which in themselves are also quite strong. So 6% in 2019, 3% in 2018. Between now and this time last year, we've added 5,000 new drugs into the pipeline. Some of these drugs in the pipeline have fallen out and some have progressed through, but the ultimate, it was a net effect, or a net gain of around 1,500 drugs. And among this, we had a pretty good variety, whether they be new chemical entities, new biologics, also biosimilars and generics. And so the pipeline is differing in its constitution, but it is continuing to shape around some key themes, and 2 of these are oncology and also gene therapies. Now, if you're looking at the pipeline by drug class, as we call it within pharma projects, oncology occupies the top 2 leading drug classes, whether they be anti-cancer immunologicals or general anti-cancer drugs. Our chart here shows gene therapies, a really interesting story, rising very steadily through this decade to being the 3rd most common drug class in the pipeline. You can see it occupied this position 20 years ago, but with some clinical setbacks and low investment, it kind of fell off, but then it's really rocketed up through 50% year-on-year increase in gene therapies, and this story has a long way to go still. So that's what some of the drugs in the pipeline. If we're looking now at clinical trials, these very often match the same trends as what we're seeing for drugs, of course. So new records in terms of the size of the pipeline. We've also had new records in terms of clinical trial activity, whether that's the 8,000 clinical trials that were initiated last year by industry, or the approximately 4,000 clinical trials that completed. Oncology continues to dominate clinical trial activity. In the pipeline, it has around about the 37% share. If we think about clinical trials, of new trials that started last year, about 40% of these were oncology. Roughly 1 in 4 of trials that completed last year were oncology. If we think about the top 20 sponsors of clinical trials, 3/4 of these, so 15 out of the top 20, have oncology as their leading therapy area by the numbers of trials they're starting. This concentration of focus on oncology does come at the expense of other areas, in particular infectious diseases, which we'll talk about in the next, in this kind of the second half of my talk. We have autoimmune and CNS in second and third place. These are still growing, not at the rate of oncology, but they are kind of jockeying for that second position. So a bit more on this top 20 clinical trial sponsors. Now, right at the top of the tree, we have Bristol Myers Squibb, elevated to number 1 on account of its acquisition of Celgene, replacing AstraZeneca. Roche, Merck, Pfizer, these are the top 5, and they have been the top 5 for a few years now. Certain companies are beginning to fall backwards in terms of their rankings of the number of new trials they're starting, but this provides opportunities for other companies to climb up the ladder. And we have our first Chinese biotech company, Jiangsu Hengrui, entering the top 10. We also have 2 other Chinese biotechs in the top 20, alongside some Japanese pharmas such as Takeda, Astellas, and Eisai. So really, it's the emergence of Asia. So that's our kind of very clinical snapshots on the metrics we're tracking there. And let's get our commercial hats on and think about deal making. And this is a slide I presented before, but I'm going to show it again because I think it really nicely tells the story of where we ended the decade and the kind of momentum that we're carrying. And we're looking at acquisitions. Through the last decade in biopharma, we had around $1.6 trillion of acquisitions spread out across 600 major deals. It's a bit of a decade of 2 halves in terms of when these deals took place. Now, the first part of the decade was relatively slow with a good baseline of activity, but nothing really huge. But we really accelerated in the second half of the decade, excusing a slight blip in 2016, which was the US election year, but really saw a good degree of industry consolidation in 2017 with some really high value acquisitions. And so through the last decade, as well as those kind of big ticket acquisitions, we saw a pretty gradual increase in the value of transactions. What the typical deal would achieve is just basically biotech and pharma valuations rose over time. The average acquisition over the last 3 years of the decade was worth $4.2 billion, a 3-fold increase at the start of the decade. Now, part of this is because of some of those big deals, where 5 of the 6 largest acquisitions took place in the last 3 years. But we also just saw gradual inflation of asset valuation. So at the start of the decade, $1 billion deal, a $1 billion bolt-on deal is a pretty large acquisition. You might be able to buy quite a sizable asset for that, potentially even an FDA-approved drug. $1 billion today doesn't really get you very far. It might get you an early-stage clinical asset, potentially just preclinical. We also had, as well as the rising valuations, tax reform passed in the US that really acts as a big catalyst for some of these large deals to take place. And lastly, where we are today, let's look at the prescription drug market. So ultimately, we know what sales are being achieved. And for the large pharma companies, it's around about $650 billion worth of sales in 2019. A very healthy amounts, growing at around about a 3% compound growth rate for the last 5 years. If anything, this growth rate will accelerate through the next 5 years, so in a pretty good position, potentially achieving something in the region of 5%. Amongst this $650 billion is very, very competitive, highly fragmented market. Over 15 companies sustaining prescription drug revenues in excess of $20 billion. So a huge amount of competition, no one company having more than a 5% market share. And that's not to mention the additional portion of the market that we aren't showing here that belongs to the generics companies and the biosimilars manufacturers. Our last slide, some of the highest selling drugs will be no surprise to you. I don't intend to spend too long here, but I just wanted to say that in the last few years, we've had drugs setting new records in terms of commercial success. So Humira has become the first drug to cross the $20 billion threshold in terms of peak year sales. It's now also achieved more than $150 billion through the course of its lifetime in cumulative sales, both records. Keytruda and Opdivo are pretty early on in their life cycle, but they may, by the time they're as mature as Humira is, we might be talking about similar numbers. These three drugs are all pipeline in a pill, if you like, with many indications and belonging to a single drug. But that's a very quick kind of whistle-stop tour of where we entered, where we started this this decade, and of course since then everything's turned upside down with COVID. Really, it's going to be interesting to kind of revisit some of these once the full year is complete and we can really quantify the effect of COVID. But most immediately, we've had this huge R&D response to find treatments, and that's the industry's done remarkably well here. Something we track extensively in Pharma Intelligence. The latest counts, we have around 3,500 clinical trials initiated or planned against COVID since the start of the year, with around about 700 pipeline drugs, not to mention some of the repurposed efforts that have been run by academic groups too. But it's industry that's now increasingly leading the clinical advances. Over 1,000 industry-sponsored trials, over 165 drugs now progressed into clinical trials belonging to the industry, split between 150 odd different companies. And we're actually beginning to get our first successes from industry, whether that be in the form of an FDA-approved antiviral for Chlorine, or emergency use authorizations for vaccines and monoclonal antibodies. These have been developed at incredible speed and with incredible success too. It's kind of ripping up the rulebook for what we expected from R&D paradigms. Just on the bottom left of this slide, we have some typical benchmarks that you'll be familiar with. It takes 10 years to develop a drug from scratch in early clinical development through to the market, and 9 out of 10 of these drugs will fail. Let's just imagine what these attrition rates for COVID will be, hopefully much, much more successful and certainly quicker. There will be lessons here that can be learned, that can be reapplied to general R&D. It's not all been easy though, and certainly COVID, as well as providing the opportunity for pharma to innovate, it's also provided a lot of challenges, and in R&D in particular, in particular with the conduct of clinical trials. Through the acute phases of the pandemic, clinical trial sites were heavily disrupted. Very often these were hospitals and they were dealing with large numbers of hospitalized patients. So we've been tracking this disruption to clinical trials through the year. I'm going to show you 2 different metrics which kind of tell the story that most of the acute disruption was in the months of May and June, April, May. But since June, we've actually begun to see a pretty good recovery in clinical trial operations. So our left-hand graph, these are trials that we can count in our product called Trial Trove. These are trials that are definitely affected by COVID. We can identify them with keyword searches and link through to a primary source that says, this is a COVID-affected trial. It's affected in this, and this way. Around about 1,000 trials, definitely an underestimate because many companies will not be disclosing at the individual trial level which of their studies are affected, but it gives a good directional trend. So you can see the acceleration in the number of trials that we're able to identify that became disrupted through April, May, June. Since June, a good stabilization and a slowdown in the number of new trials that we've identified that were disrupted. But there still has been week-on-week increases, so clearly some disruption does linger. Among the 1,000 or so trials here, 3/4 of these are actually back open for business. So they've either been able to complete or enrollment is back underway. About 1/4 of them remain disrupted, either closed for enrollment or they've actually had to terminate. The right-hand side, this is a graph showing a bigger picture view. So all of industry's trials that are currently ongoing, around about 15 or 16,000. At any one time, you'd expect a proportion of these to be temporarily closed. Any number of reasons why. It might be clinical reasons, commercial, strategic reasons. Also, the pandemic is obviously another big reason why clinical trial sites were forced to close. But usually it's around about 1% of ongoing trials are closed. Through the pandemic months, this shot up to 4% of industry's trials disclosed as closed, peaking in mid-May. But since then, like the other metric, we have had a stabilization and then a recovery, not yet at pre-pandemic baseline levels, that 1%, but going in that direction. Driving that change has been trials that were suspended or closed reopening, but also new trials starting. So at the start of the year, we had about 15,000 ongoing trials. This is now 16,000. So industry is able to start new trials despite the pandemic. But what does all of this mean? Clinical trial disruption is one thing, but obviously there are downstream measures, R&D momentum, regulatory filings, new drug approvals. It's too soon to say on some of those later measures. If anything, this year should be a pretty good year in terms of new drugs that reach the market. But we can quantify the effects on R&D delays. And I'm going to introduce a graph here that looks at phase transitions. Anytime a drug moves between the clinical phases, be that 1 to 2, 2 to 3, 3 to regulatory. Last year, pre-pandemic, we had the baseline of around about 40 successful transitions each month. This year, we're tracking at around about 30% below average, with notable underperformance in some of those key pandemic lockdown months. This isn't shooting right back up to the baseline. It's, the disruption is lingering, and the longer it lingers, the worse the effects downstream will be. Inevitably, this will lead to a degree of scarring on the pipeline, which will result in, further down the line, delayed catalysts, fewer regulatory filings, and drug launches. I'm going to finish up with more of a commercial view of what the pandemic is meaning to the industry. This is our penultimate slide. I'm going to look at the top of the food chain. What's it meaning for big pharma and big pharma's sales? So on this chart, we're plotting quarterly financial results. For the average kind of big pharma peer set, we've averaged them out in that thicker pink line. We've also highlighted some individual performances as well. We've pinched or we've indexed these sales around Q1 of 2019. Two reasons why. It gives us a pre-pandemic baseline, but it also shows very often Q4 the previous year heading into Q1 of the next year, you do get a sequential sales decline simply as a result of typical buying patterns, so it's nothing to be concerned of. But what we had in 2019 was quite a nice growth profile for big pharma, kind of quarter-on-quarter growth, quite steady. And if anything, in Q1 of this year, although there was a slight decline, this decline was softened by a bit of stockpiling as patients and wholesalers refilled prescriptions quicker. Q2 was obviously the worst month. Had greatly reduced patient mobility, fewer new treatment starts, fewer elective procedures, and the unwinding of this stockpiling effect. So 9% year-on-year growth in Q1 unwound all the way into a 4% decline in Q2, which was the worst pandemic month. But we have seen a bit of a recovery in Q3. If anything, we're looking at a bit of a V-shaped recovery, to such that the point that even for the first 3 quarters of the year, compared to this time last year, the pharma industry, at least in terms of big pharma, is showing 2% year-on-year growth. So remarkable resilience. Resilience is the story for big pharma. Our last slide here is just going to look at the other end of the spectrum in early stage biotech. And it's certainly been a period of opportunity. A huge amount of opportunity because of the access to capital, the amount of investment that's floating around. And we're showing this via the line graph here and the different vehicles by which companies raise money. A huge spike in Q2 when $45 billion was raised, and we'd already exceeded the prior year's totals by the end of July of this year. Very often, companies were looking to venture financing or public offerings to raise this money. So this all allows a lot of early stage innovation. It might be progression for COVID-19 assets, for example, Moderna raising $2 billion via a public offering, but also more generally just progression of pipeline and early stage concepts, platform development across the board really. And the amount of cash that's floating around for biotech creates this really interesting environment where it's very much a seller's market. Investors are very interested in the sector. Valuations for biotech companies are rising. This is one factor that's deterring pharma from looking to be. It's been a quiet year in terms of acquisitions, although we have seen a few in recent months. So that's my quick review of where we were and what the pandemic is meaning, and hopefully this will tee up our next presenters, Sarah and Sam. I'll just wrap up with our kind of key takeaways. Industry was hitting new peaks, whether that's peaks in terms of R&D metrics or commercial execution. The COVID has allowed the industry to show a lot of commercial and clinical resilience and also show its scientific expertise in real time to the public. I haven't had too much time to go into it today, but some of the challenges that the pandemic has posed have also provided opportunities for the industry to modernize, whether that be in the form of clinical trials that is decentralized, expedited regulatory pathways and overlapping clinical phases, and also critically collaboration between industry, regulators, academia, etc. But yeah, thanks a lot. I'm looking forward to my co-presenters and any questions you might have.
Great. Thank you very much, Dan, for a great presentation. And if anyone has a question for Dan, you can put it in the Q&A box now, and we'll come back to it at the end. So just bear with us a second. I'm just going to introduce our next speaker. Okay, so I'm delighted to introduce our second presenter of the day, Sarah Rickwood, Vice President, European Thought Leadership at IQVIA. Sarah has 28 years experience as a consultant to the pharmaceutical industry, having worked in Accenture's pharmaceutical strategy practice prior to joining IQVIA. She has an extremely broad experience of international pharmaceutical industry issues, having worked at most of the world's leading pharmaceutical companies in the US, Europe, Japan, and leading emerging markets. She is now Vice President, European Marketing and Thought Leadership at IQVIA in a team that she has run for 10 years. So over to you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Tara, and thank you everybody who's joined the webinar today. I'm going to talk about 9 themes that are going to drive change in 2021 and beyond. Some of them are issues that are certainly directly affected by, and in some cases, positive change that has been accelerated by the COVID pandemic. Some of them actually were issues that were there prior to the pandemic, but are really going to see their full impact on changing the shape of pharma and healthcare in 2021 and beyond, regardless of the pandemic. I'd say 2 things in relation to the pandemic. I'll come back to this point in a little bit more detail at the end. But first, we're dealing with not 1 crisis, but 3 crises here. And because we're dealing with 3 crises, it's going to take a long time before we really can say that all of the pandemic is behind us. In fact, I'd argue that the first half of the 2020s are going to be flavored by the pandemic and its consequences. And here's why. We have the infection crisis, which is what we've lived through in 2020. And that infection crisis, we hope, will be addressed by the vaccines which have come through with such an amazing effort from the pharmaceutical industry. As those rolls out in 2021, we will address that infection crisis. The challenge is that the infection crisis has triggered 2 other crises, and we're going to be living with the consequences of those through 2021 and beyond. The first is a crisis of healthcare systems. The non-COVID treatments of patients in healthcare systems have been delayed, they have been changed, they have been negatively impacted by the fact that healthcare systems have had to pivot to COVID treatment, and addressing those patient backlogs, which vary by country and they vary by therapy area, but they're undoubtedly there all the time, is going to take a long period. And of course, if patients aren't treated, there will be healthcare implications for many years to come. We're only at the beginning of the economic crisis that has been triggered by the pandemic. Whilst we saw really worrying drops in GDP in Q2 of 2020, the fact of the matter is the full impact of mass unemployment is yet to be realized. And that will mean that healthcare system budgets will be constrained. So at best, I can say that we're not living in a post-pandemic environment in 2021. We're living in a vaccine plus environment. As we go through the year, the vaccine is going to release the constrictions that we've had to live by for the majority of 2020, but they will still be with us for a period of time. And the fact of the matter is the impact of the pandemic will undoubtedly be with us for years to come. So let's take a look at these points in that context. The other thing, if we move to the next slide, I'd just like to point out is, of course, if we look which I hope we will when we get to that slide, thank you, at the impact of the pandemic on stakeholders in the healthcare system. In terms of how much change it happens, disruption here is a neutral term. It could be both positive or negative, but change is what it really means. I'd argue that the degree of change is going to vary by the major regions of the world. And that's partly about culture. It's partly about where healthcare environments were prior to the pandemic. It may be about legal or healthcare system structures as well. So change needs to be looked at on a region by region basis. But nevertheless, of course, patients have moved to more remote healthcare engagement, embracing in some cases very enthusiastically more digital engagements. And physicians have also had to deal with this more remote healthcare system, deal with more restricted communications with pharma. Payers have started, but definitely haven't finished their reallocation of budgets and the way that they will respond to constrained circumstances. And hospitals, of course, have been at the sharp end of the COVID pandemic and have seen structural and other changes because of that. So change is regional, but some directions are universal. If we move to the next slide, I just want to talk about the way that pharma will be affected by and must respond to COVID-19's disruption of healthcare. That COVID-19 has impacted non-COVID patient healthcare dynamics is indisputable. The data that IQVIA has shown decreases in patient load, whether it's virtual or face-to-face, but also office visits across markets. Telehealth surged in response, but is not the whole solution, and there's been fallbacks after that. The way that pharma engaged with its own healthcare, that's HCP, customers has been disrupted. That was one of the most immediate and tangible impacts on pharma's business of the pandemic. And we have to see how that will change permanently. And yes, in the near term, but actually as is carrying on, there has been an impact on prescribing dynamics, and that in turn will have an impact on key elements of pharma business. Backlogs are not measured all in one way. We can't calculate a global backlog, but what we observe is country by country, point by point, a backlog of non-COVID patient treatment care has accumulated, and that will need to be addressed, and it will not be rapid to address it in a healthcare system that is still dealing with the consequences of COVID infection, as well as mobilizing to roll out vaccines. Pharma will play its role here. Obviously, pharma has made a huge positive impact on addressing the pandemic with the development of treatments and vaccine. Anyway, there's more to do, whether it's supporting telehealth journeys, making sure that medicines are available effectively in more resilient supply chains, developing self-administration of medicines so that patients can keep out of facilities, and building new ways to engage their customers. It's going to be a necessary part of pharma's business for the foreseeable future. We move to the next slide. One of the areas, of course, that is most important for the future value growth of pharma is launch. And this was something that we looked at really carefully to begin with during the pandemic crisis, because we presumed that the drop in face-to-face patient visits was going to have a differential impact on launch products, innovative launch products, and also growth products. Why? Because those products are disproportionately driven by the need to acquire new prescriptions and also to see switches of patients from an older medication to those newer medication. And those were the types of prescriptions that generally happened prior to the pandemic in face-to-face meetings between patients and doctors. And once those face-to-face meetings didn't happen, the dynamic, that is the new plus switch market, contracted in many cases. And that had the potential to impact on launch. Other things, of course, could. A big question was whether regulators would slow down approvals and payers and health technology assessors would slow down what they do. In fact, regulators did not, by and large, slow down. Launches made their way into the market at a rate that was commensurate with historical norms or even higher. But the question is, what did they do when they were on the market? And if we look at the left-hand side, this is using the IQVIA Midas data to pull out the sales in 2020 of products that first entered the market in 2020. And the conclusion so far, and this is only data to August, is that there are a small number of products that have done very well, and they've done very well because of their US sales during the pandemic. But the larger group of innovative products, products that have genuine value, have been very challenged. They have made relatively low sales so far, and the question is how they will do going forward. The three products that have done well during the pandemic because of their US sales are two oral migraine agents, Ubrelvy and Nurtec. Both of them launched at the beginning of the year. Obviously, this analysis favors those products that were launched early. Now, oral administration, in other words, patient self-administration, may be a important contributor, of course not the only contributor to their success. And then Tepezza, which is the first ever treatment for a very rare, very serious eye disease. So self-administered products seem to have the potential to succeed, and products that are for patients who have no treatments, where the whole of the healthcare system will come together in order to ensure they get those treatments. There's a triple negative breast cancer product which has also done well. Let's move to the next slide. However, these launches, if we move to the next slide, will have to grow in an environment where the economic crisis starts to kick in. In the top left-hand corner, you've got to look at GDP growth. And we're looking at the Great Recession of 2008 plus with the COVID-19 induced recession. We can see there's been bounce back in COVID-19, but the fact of the matter is much of the pain has to come still. And if we take this issue specifically to the pharma market, one of the things that is different about pharma in terms of how it will ride out the recession this time as opposed to last time is a question of how much savings there are going to come out of loss of exclusivity over the next few years. If we go back to 2009 and look at the proportion of the value of the pharmaceutical market that was going to go off patent in the 5 years following 2009, it was about 30% of global market value, and most of it was small molecules that were about to go off patent and save payers money. Scroll forward to 2019 and look at the proportion of the market value that's going to go off patent in the next 5 years. It's about the same gross figure, 200 billion, but as a proportion, it's only 19% of all prescription medicine sales, and much more of it, 44%, is biologics. And while biologics can and do biosimilarize, so far they have done so with perhaps less effective cost savings than small molecules. This means payers have less capacity to save money. And if they have less capacity to save money, and there is overall healthcare system financial challenge, they will have less to spend on innovative medicines. And I think that will be an increasing challenge in the next few years. What it will do is it will highlight the importance of data and outcomes in terms of real world evidence or about the value of products as a differentiator that separates the successes from the products that do less well in the new market. Let's move to the next slide and talk a little bit about the way that pharma engages with its customers who are healthcare professionals. So the data on the left-hand side is about promotional contact time. It comes from IQVIA's Channel Dynamics database, and it's looking at the overall millions of minutes that, if you add them all up, pharma had with doctors during 2020, that's the light blue line, and 2019, that's the dark blue dashed line. I'm looking at the US and EU5 here because they tell different stories. In both cases, of course, face-to-face contact went down during April, but of course, remote engagement could rise. The difference between the US and Europe is that in the EU5, overall time has been lost, a substantial amount of overall time, because whilst there was recovery, there was a huge amount of time lost during the height of the pandemic. So that is time that probably would have been spent promoting launches, that would have been spent building growth launches that just didn't exist during 2020. And the question is, how is it going to be made up in 2021? The other thing that we can measure through the big surveys that we do is what doctors want in terms of the type of engagement they want with pharma. That's changed because of the pandemic, because of the fact that they've seen more of this remote engagement. The fact of the matter is there is a preference to more digital engagement. On-demand information is starting to be preferred over one-to-one engagement. Doctors, of course, they aren't satisfied fully with remote interactions. None of us are, I'm sure. But nevertheless, remote is probably going to be a more important part of a hybrid commercial model going forward, because while face-to-face engagement came back after the first wave, it did not come back fully. Then if we take a look on the next slide, we can see some of the trends that I think will be important, which have been accelerated by the pandemic. So during the infection peaks, we saw a move to remote healthcare. Telemedicine claims in the US, for example, ballooned. And we saw a rise, and these are only a few examples, in the digital technologies which can be supportive and enable home healthcare, as well as a very definite interest in and switch to dosing regimes for molecules that free patients from clinic visits. Now, this was a trend that was already well established prior to the pandemic, but it's been accelerated by the pandemic. And if we look at Merck's Keytruda, which we saw in the previous presentation as one of the most valuable medicines in the world, it's an example of a product that has seen approvals that increase this home delivery and patient convenience in this case by reducing, halving in fact, clinical visits. So pharma will see a change in the type of products that payers and patients and doctors want to see developed, as well as a change in the way that it's delivered. Let's move to the next slide. One of the areas that is going to be most affected by this new digitization of healthcare provision is probably going to be CNS. So I'm talking here very broadly about the whole of the CNS area, which for many years has been, in many cases, very heavily genericized. If you think about depression, anxiolytics, hypnotics, and so on and so forth. These are extremely high volume areas, but they're largely generic areas, and therefore they haven't been quite so interesting to innovative pharmaceutical companies. But of course, the unmet need is still there. Prevalence of mental disorders and disease burden for mental disorders is very, very high. What's changed is that digital technologies will start to drive the better management of CNS conditions, and also be part and parcel of the impact of new CNS therapies that will come into the market. Some of those CNS therapies won't actually be molecular. We've already seen the approval of digital therapeutics in, for example, cognitive behavioral therapy. So starting 2021, we expect that there is going to be a renaissance in the CNS area in value terms, in terms of growth, and in terms of the launches that come through in the market. There'll also be changes geographically if we move to the next slide as far as the global market is concerned. So China was already starting to become a much more important market as far as innovative medicines was concerned than it had historically been. Bear in mind, China is the world's second largest pharmaceutical market and has been for almost a decade. But during that time, it hasn't been important for the most recent launches, the most innovative medicine. But that's changing, and it's changing fast, and it's a change that could be accelerated by COVID. If we look at the right-hand side, we can see that the number of new active substances that NAS's launches coming into the Chinese market in 2020 was well above the historic average. That's not just COVID, that's the fact that the regulatory system has become more effective. But if we also look at the appetite for innovation in terms of innovative branded products, the proportion of the Chinese market that is accounted for by these products is growing, and it's growing faster than the Chinese market as a whole. So as China comes out of the pandemic, perhaps in better economic shape than some of the economies of the West, as this renewed increase in innovation happens, we would expect that global players will increasingly prioritize China for their innovative launch. Then lastly, my penultimate slide, if we pick up on that point about economic crisis and healthcare system budget challenge, a big question for 2021 is, of course, going to be, will biosimilars come to the rescue in terms of making cost savings for healthcare systems? Because the fact of the matter is, biosimilars biologic loss of exclusivity, and therefore the possibilities for biosimilars will be a much higher proportion of all loss of exclusivity over the next 5 years. Well, uptakes have increased serially in Europe, which is the most mature block of the biosimilars market, with every single biosimilar launch pretty much that has happened. But not all countries are as efficient as the most efficient countries. And I'd expect that because of economic necessity, during 2021 and beyond, there will be more pro-biosimilar policies as countries realize they have to make the savings that they can potentially realize out of these products. So if we just take a look at that vaccine plus environment in the next slide, we know that vaccines are now available. They've been approved, an absolutely massive effort. We also know some of those vaccines are extremely effective, 90% plus effectiveness. What we don't know, and this is why we still have to live with uncertainty for a period of time, is whether there will be roadblocks in terms of the rollout of those vaccines, supply issues. There almost certainly will be, because that is the nature of the beast. And the question of immunity length. How long will immunity last with vaccines? It could become like an annual flu event. We have already seen announced in the UK that a new strain of COVID that perhaps is more easily transmissible has evolved. So we're going to live with this social distancing and vaccination programs for some period of time to come. So just in summary on the final slide, and I apologize I've run over a tiny bit, what do the 2020s have in store? If I were to distill my 9 points plus one into 4 pieces, they would be these. Healthcare systems will see major shifts because of the COVID event, and some of those shifts will be permanent and will have to be responded to by pharmaceutical companies. There will be new market trends in areas such as how pharma engages with its clients, how healthcare systems define value and what they're prepared to pay for, and the type of product and whether it is patient administrable by themselves or not. The vaccine plus environment will be with us for some period of time, and growth opportunities exist therapeutically beyond the obvious oncology and other areas, in CNS, geographically, in China's rise as an innovative powerhouse, and in the off-patent sector by the renewed importance of biosimilars. Thank you, and back to you, Tara.
Thank you so much, Sarah. And again, if you have any questions for Sarah, please feel free to drop them into the chat now. So now we're going to move to the last presenter of today's session, Saman Kay, Solutions Consultant for Regulatory Intelligence at Clarivate Analytics. Saman recently joined Clarivate after holding the role of Regulatory Intelligence Lead at Gilead Sciences and has a long history of various roles within regulatory affairs. Sam's main goal is to bring regulatory affairs into a more strategic focus through high-quality regulatory intelligence, enabling rapid access of life-saving medicines and medical devices across the globe. So over to you, Sam. And you're muted, Sam. You're on mute, Sam.
Sam from...
There we go.
There you go. How about now?
Perfect.
Fantastic. There you go. So good afternoon all. I think I was wrestling with the controls too, so apologies for that. Really good presentations from both Sarah and Daniel. So thank you both very much for that. I'm going to take a slightly different angle with regards to what I'll be talking about today. So effectively, what I'll be talking about today is maybe looking more to, oh, sorry, if you, there you go. There you go, right. So what I'll be looking at today is more the future of manufacturing. So cast your minds into the future of what is happening. And what we're going to do today is take a regulatory view at what is going to happen in the future. So the reason I can justify that is by pointing to the reality that the pharmaceutical industry is one of the most regulated industries in the world, actually only second to banking, which means that the regulations dictate what pharmaceutical companies can and can't do, where their innovations tend to drive in certain directions. And so this is what we'll be looking at today. Before I start, I'm just going to introduce myself just very briefly. So as Tara mentioned, I was the Global Regulatory Intelligence Lead for Gilead. I used to work at PricewaterhouseCoopers, or PwC, for some of you who know that, as a lead consultant. I used to be a deputy QPPV, an RP, that's a responsible person for those who don't know, and regulatory head for a pharmaceutical company called Key Pharmaceuticals. Before that, I was a lecturer at Kingston Pharmacy School. I'm a pharmacist by background, and prior to that, if you're at all interested, I was an investment banker. Clearly, I don't like money, so I moved into the pharmaceutical industry. So today, as I said, I'm going to be talking about the future of manufacturing, and there's a few key things I wanted to sort of highlight with regards to manufacturing. So firstly, I'm going to outline the benefits. So wouldn't it be nice if we had a technology, a manufacturing technology that nearly eliminates the need for tech transfers, where you're scaling up or scaling down, or moving manufacturing site, or changing the manufacturing process. You'll always need tech transfers according to the regulations. Is there going to be a manufacturing process that will eliminate this? Is there one which has a smaller manufacturing footprint? So effectively, current batch manufacturing processes take up a lot of space, a lot of land. Land is becoming precious all the time, especially in the smaller countries. So I'm thinking like Bangladesh, the United Kingdom. These are sort of smaller land-based countries where land is at a premium. The value of the land is at a premium. So smaller manufacturing sites would be a helpful move in that direction. Another key thing that we would like from a future manufacturing technology is faster lead times. What I mean by that is getting the medicine from an API and excipient stage, so all the base materials of the medicine, and pushing it over to the final product so patients can hold them, yeah, and use them effectively. Okay, so that's the lead time. We're trying to make that a lot smaller. Okay. Cool. We're also looking at a 70% reduction in time required for quality control. Okay, and this is really important because what we want to do is we want to improve the quality of the medicines, but at the same time reduce the amount of resources required to check and maintain the quality of the products. This is especially true if we're going into very mature and highly regulated markets like Japan or the USA, for example, or even Europe, where we have very high standards for quality. And finally, achieving full scale up in under 2 months. So the dream of a lot of companies is being able to scale up very fast, very quickly. And COVID really has emphasized the need to do that because as soon as we developed the vaccine, we needed to go from a very small clinical trial to a very, very, very large clinical trial in such a short space of time. So scale up has been at the forefront of a lot of people's minds recently, but in effect, this has always been a problem. This has always been a problem for us. Sometimes scale ups can take up to 9, 10, 12 months for you to get from a small clinical batch all the way up until commercial size batches. Okay, and scaling up is an important strategic decision. So when I'm looking at all these technologies that will improve the manufacturing process, I obviously have a technology in mind, and the technology I'm talking about is continuous manufacturing. So continuous manufacturing occurs ironically in every single industry apart from the pharmaceutical industry. It's still a new technology for us. It's been invented. The technology is there for the food industry, and for those of you who are very familiar with manufacturing, you'll know that a lot of the manufacturing processes we use for food are also used in the pharmaceutical industry. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about traditional batch manufacturing process, and really what I want to emphasize is how slow and how high risk the process is. So I'm specifically looking at small molecules, but the same concepts apply for biologics and biosimilars and generics and so on and so forth. Okay, the same concepts still apply. So traditionally, a batch, which has been around for about 200 years, the concept of a batch is effectively, I'm going to put in 20 kilograms of API, 400 kilograms of excipients. We're going to push it all together. We're going to blend all this material together. There's going to be a wet granulation process. There's going to be a drying process, milling process, and so on and so forth, right to the end. Right up until we get to coating. Maybe there's some other aspects that you want to do with it as well, depending on the crystalline structure of the API. Without getting into the details too much, what I really want to show here is the fact that after every process, we have to store the product in the right conditions, and then when the next stage is ready, we put the barrel out, and effectively they are barrels still, so we are still using 200-year-old processes for this. Amazingly, this is happening even for blockbuster medicines. We're still using barrels, and then we pour the barrel into the wet granulation phase. That comes out, it goes into another barrel. That's quality checked, okay? And you'll see here that quality control has to happen after every single stage. You can see how this can be dangerous because if, for example, in the middle of your process, quality control fails, what happens is that you have to reject the whole batch and start again with brand new excipients. And everything that you've paid for, the API, the 400 kilograms of excipients, that all goes in the bin. Okay, so this is a very laborious process. Okay, and of course the lead time. So remember, the lead time is the time from the individual ingredients all the way up until getting the tablet. That takes between 2 to 8 months, sometimes longer. It's not unusual, especially for biologics. It's not unusual for it to be a year-long process. What does that mean? Realistically, that means that if you have a demand in January for a drug, you can't meet that demand until you go through the lead time, the purchasing part. So it usually takes about 3 months. This is why drug shortages tend to be, if you're familiar with drug shortages, they tend to be about 3 months to about 6 months, depending on what part of the process you're looking at. So this is the blocking factor. This is what's causing drug shortages, excluding all the commercial decisions for drug shortages, which are illegal, of course. So I did say I'm a regulatory focused person. So here we're going to look at the regulations. Okay, so the regulations are predefined. The batch sizes are generally predefined to the regulators. So you'll say I'm going to make X number of batches, and they're going to be X number in size to the regulators. Of course, what that means is that you can't adapt to demand. So there's no supply and demand built into your manufacturing process. I've already mentioned the quality control aspects. That's QC, quality control. I can fail at any point. And of course, if we look at the storage conditions, we require even larger amounts of space just to store the intermediate ingredients and then maintain the quality of that during the process. And if you change any part of the process, you're going to have to let the regulators know. So again, it's going to be a long process for you to do it. So there needs to be a tech transfer, that you need to submit it. If there is a clinical need to do it, you have to do it within a certain time frame in certain markets. This all becomes quite a nightmare, which is why such an organization exists around the manufacturing process. It's a very difficult process. This is why CMOs exist, because CMOs, which is contract manufacturing organizations, they exist purely because this is such a complex process. Okay. So now I'm going to look at continuous manufacturing. So excuse the poor graphics. I'm no artist, so I can't make beautiful slides like the other two, but hopefully this will illustrate the point. The point I'm trying to make here is that continuous manufacturing doesn't require storage at every stage. Rather, it flows through the product. Okay, there's a major advantage to this. Okay, in that you can have electronic quality control at each stage of the flow process, and it's live, it's constant, it's 24 hours a day manufacturing, 24 hours a day quality checking. That gives you a huge amount of data. So when you look at the data from a quality perspective, you have a lot of data to look at. You can see averages, you can see trends, you can start seeing deviations happening before they go out of reach, out of scope. And then you can start correcting these and bring it back into scope. Okay? And this is the advantages of having continuous manufacturing. Now, the beauty about it is that you can release drugs 70% faster. So we're going from 2 weeks to like 2 days effectively, right? And the best advantage is the lead time is 12 hours, okay? And this is the average lead time. So there's certain drugs, like for example, someone tried it with paracetamol, the lead time was about 4 hours, end to end. And they were able to hold a paracetamol tablet 4 hours later, and it was continuously 24 hours manufacturing this process, okay? So this is the beauty of continuous manufacturing, is that you can start adapting to demand, okay? Because if you know yesterday there was large demand for your paracetamol tablet, you can address that demand immediately, okay? You don't have to wait 3-4 months. The idea of drug shortages will be, the risk of drug shortages will be decreased, okay? So again, the regulatory focus here is, because we're moving away from the idea of a batch, okay, because this is a mind frame, this is an idea, this batch, we're moving away from that idea. So the concept of a batch still has to be there because of the regulations. So instead, what people have done is they said, okay, a period of time of manufacturing is a batch, okay? And this could be, the size of the batch can vary, okay? And this is called the design space. And this is what a lot of companies like Johnson & Johnson have done. They've made the design space, so they're able to flex the size of the batch depending on the demand. So now we have a lead time which is shorter, and we can flex the demand so we can address the needs of patients, as opposed to trying to hit it lucky, I guess what the demand will be in the future. Of course, nobody knows if they're going to get ill tomorrow. So this can only be a guessing game at best. So there's a few issues around this. Really, some regulators have very little experience around the continuous manufacturing process. And there's, of course, additional challenges around the data and the quality, the data integrity, because remember, this is all an automated process, okay? So because this is an automated process, you have to bear in mind that all these things are collected digitally, and therefore that leads to more risk when you're looking at it from a data integrity perspective, okay? Because you can tweak it, you can change things, and the regulators may not necessarily know. So there has to be additional checks around data integrity, data quality, okay? So that's continuous manufacturing. Now, when we look at the supply chain, this is going to be the biggest impact, what we have. For those of you who like the environment, who support the environmental aspects around it, the important thing here is the change in the supply chain, okay? So we're moving away from a single manufacturing source. Let's say it's manufactured typically in India, in China, in the United States, or in Europe, or even in Brazil, for example. We're moving away from this idea that we'll have one manufacturing site and we distribute the drug out. Instead, we're going to move to a model where we have very, very small manufacturing sites in multiple locations. So these manufacturing sites, so a continuous manufacturing plant, is in total 4 meters by 2 meters. You can fit it in the back of a truck. That's how small the manufacturing site is. This gives it huge flexibility, especially in countries like Africa, in hard to reach countries in Asia. You're able to bring the manufacturing to the site's need, okay? You're able to move the manufacturing site around, appropriate to the supply chain, okay? Assuming you can maintain all the controls around it. So we're talking about humidity and so on and so forth. But assuming you can control all the area around it, you can fit this manufacturing site into the back of a truck and move it. So this is a very, very powerful technology, okay? So what are the challenges? So I know I'm going to be running a little bit over, but I'll try and address the challenges as fast as I can. So first challenge is really the mindset. It's the idea of a batch, moving away from the idea that you have to manufacture a small batch and then increase that batch. That's going to be the old way of thinking. With continuous manufacturing, we're looking at a new way of thinking about manufacturing. So instead of having a small batch and then increasing it to a large batch, rather than that, have multiple manufacturing units. So you have one manufacturing plant and then 2 manufacturing plants and 3 manufacturing plants to double and triple the amount you're manufacturing, right? This makes it a far more powerful way of manufacturing your drugs, your chemicals, okay? This is a very, very effective way of doing it. So that's the mindset. The regulatory challenges is the other challenge. So obviously I come from a regulatory background. I know very well that continuous manufacturing is not well defined in smaller markets. So even in markets which are large markets like China, India, Brazil, even those large markets, they don't have any manufacturing guidelines around continuous manufacturing. In fact, the only 2 major regions that have continuous manufacturing guidelines is the USA and Europe. Luckily, there's also ICH guidelines which have come out very recently. So hopefully, a lot of these other countries will catch up. In which case, you can start in your continuous manufacturing journey. So some data to back up what I'm saying. So I work with Clarivate, and we have a regulatory intelligence system. The beauty about the regulatory intelligence system is that I'm able to see what the trends are around certain technologies from a regulatory perspective. You can see over time, the number of regulations has been increasing dramatically up until 2019. There was a slight dip in 2020. I didn't include the 2020 statistics because really it doesn't reflect what's happening in the regulatory world. I think everyone in regulatory has been focusing fully on COVID, to be fair. So there's been very little movement in around continuous manufacturing. But you can see the trend is increasing. The interest around continuous manufacturing is increasing from the regulators themselves. They want to see this technology happening because there's higher quality, it's faster, it's going to remove the shortages, which is a big problem in a lot of markets. So this is the trend we're going in. So there's two key areas I want to look at, and that's the ICH papers that have been released in 2018. Okay, ICH Q13. If you're interested, do look it up. It's a very interesting document. And the EMA 2025 strategy document. So the EMA is the European Medicines Agency. Their strategy document outlines how they want to look at continuous manufacturing and push it in that direction. The second one is the FDA. The FDA have released a very, very big milestone around the paper, and this is around continuous manufacturing, and that is the quality guidance document for continuous manufacturing. This is a very, very, very important document, and it's a very big milestone for those who are interested in continuous manufacturing, because that means there's regulations in the US market for continuous manufacturing. Okay. My last slide, I'm going to really very quickly go over this, but effectively, if we look at the life cycle of a drug, there's two key areas where continuous manufacturing plays a large part in. But of course, it plays an important part in all the life cycle of the drug. But there's two key areas. One area is the preclinical CMC strategy. This is a very, very difficult area. For those of you who are familiar with it, it's effectively you're trying to plan the manufacturing processes throughout the whole life cycle of the drug, even before you get into commercialization of your drug, or even before you get into preclinical studies. Pardon me. So that's a very difficult task to do, because you're having to use a lot of data and a lot of analysis around that. And the second part is building the regulatory strategy for launching the drug in multiple markets. How do you do that if not all the markets recognize continuous manufacturing? Okay, and that's a real big challenge. And the way I would argue you address it is really through having a robust regulatory intelligence system. Okay, and just to summarize it off, I'm going to do some shameless self-promotion. Cortellis is the way I would do it, is because we can provide very high quality reg intel. There's an enhanced AdCom reports around continuous manufacturing. There's pre-major intelligence reports, and there's global comparison tables so you can look at it. But the important thing I want to really emphasize here is not that you can use Cortellis, but more importantly, that you should have really robust regulatory intelligence, because that would enable you to have continuous manufacturing. You can talk to CMOs about it, but again, your internal regulatory intelligence department should be the ones driving this forward. Okay, so this is where the conversation should be happening. Right, I feel like I've run out of time. So Tara, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sam, for a great presentation, and thank you to all of our speakers. So I'm conscious that we're over time, but we have had so many questions coming in that it would be great just to do one round of questions. So Dan, I'll start with you if that's okay. And the question is, sorry, just bear with me. Question is, what do you see as the main challenges for the industry to successfully decentralize more clinical trials?
Yeah, I'm really glad this question came in, so thanks for whoever submitted it. It's like some of Sarah's trends certainly didn't existed before the pandemic, but and would have continued to exist, but certainly has been accelerated by you might think the hurdle is a technological one, but when you speak to people that are implementing it, the technologies are all there really. It's more a case of regulatory acceptance of them. And it's validating these technologies and then knowing that if you use that technology, by the time you come to present that data to a regulator, it's going to meet the required thresholds. So it's not discovering new ways of communicating virtually or tracking a symptom digitally. It's just having the confidence that if you do that, then it's going to be deemed as equivalent and acceptable from regulators. If you were to ask the same question about what the hurdles to a European audience, one thing that emerges a bit more in Europe, less so in America, is also around data protection and data security. So I would say not technological limitations, but more regulatory and data protection are the key concerns for to overcome for decentralizing more trials.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Sarah, a question for you. Are there any therapy areas other than CNS that will be driven by digitalization?
Okay, well, if we scroll right back to the beginning of digital therapies, the first digital healthcare support which was approved by the FDA was Blue Star, which was actually a diabetes product. It wasn't actually a therapeutic for diabetes. It was supporting the better effective use of molecular therapeutics for diabetes, but diabetes was actually the first area. So there's undoubtedly digital potential in a wide range of therapy areas. But the reason why I highlighted it for CNS is because I think that it lends itself particularly to digitization. And for a number of reasons. The first is that these, so our phones, are habit forming. We have them with us all of the time. They modify behavior. If digital therapies or treatments are designed to modify and shape behavior, it's a pretty certain bet that a phone app could be a part of that. Now, many healthcare apps exist, of course. Very, very few of those, a tiny percentage, have actual clinical relevance, and an even smaller percentage of them have actually been trialed or even approved. But I think that the CNS area, because it's often about behavior, because both pharmacotherapy always existed alongside other forms of therapy for many CNS area, makes it particularly ripe for digitization. It's by no means the only therapy area where digitization is important. And anything which involves an element of lifestyle and coaching support. Diabetes, of course, comes to mind almost immediately. I think has considerable potential for digitization, and in many cases that's already happening.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Sarah. And then Sam, because you were focusing on manufacturing, I'm going to put you on the spot with this one. How much reshoring is expected to happen in the US? What are the key challenges to reshoring the manufacturing and supply chain?
Yeah, it's a good question. I can't see what will happen in the future. Certainly, the trends show that it is a bit of a difficult question, in fairness, without me looking at the data. But yes, I mean, there's probably two ways of answering this one. No, well, I'll leave this one if you don't mind, because I don't have the data in front of me, so I don't think I have the confidence to answer this one realistically without having just a guess. To be honest.
No problem. Understood. Sorry to put you on the spot. Any comments from Sarah or Dan on that one, or shall we leave it there?
I think that on the question of where manufacturing is around the world, the early part of the pandemic, when it was China that was directly affected, did worry people because it threw into pretty sharp relief that the global supply chain for the bulk of products, the high volume products, had become increasingly dependent upon China for the APIs and India for finishing the generics over the period of a decade. Clearly, there were export restrictions, for example, in India early on. But actually, I think that the global supply chain has been pretty resilient. And whilst there are calls still for security of manufacturing and supply, which could imply moving manufacturing back to the US or indeed Europe, I don't know that that's necessarily the priority of governments now, if the supply chain has proven that it can be resilient in the face of this kind of challenge. But then again, if supply chains do become more technologically sophisticated, and basically more spread out rather than centralized, perhaps some elements will come back.
Thank you. And Dan,
I'd
did you
agree.
want to add a comment? Yep.
Well, this is outside of my areas, but I'm willing to kind of speculate a bit. But I think wholesale onshoring is going to be more expensive than, in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic and realizing that supply chains were disrupted. That was, I suppose, a critical need. But supply chains were resilient. I know in the UK, they're actually speaking to some of the key providers of ICU medicines. They were able to meet demand. So I think there will be bigger priorities for how we recover from the economic effects. Onshoring of API production is hugely expensive, and perhaps not the best use of investment money to help recovery. The more I read, it's just more about building resilience into supply chain. So having a China plus one strategy where you perhaps have a little bit of redundancy and you have multiple sources. One of those might be internal or domestic, but certainly not a wholesale shift away from the current models.
Brilliant, thank you. And then Sam, just one final question, if you don't mind, on continuous. Will generic firms also benefit from continuous manufacturing? And if so, how?
No, I think that's a good question. So generic firms will definitely benefit from continuous manufacturing due to the reduced amount of resource requirements. Remember, continuous manufacturing not just has higher yields, but you're able to have smaller footprint sizes on the manufacturing site, less storage requirements for the intermediary product. So, of course, there's an immediate financial benefit to generic companies adopting this. The same is also true for biologics and biosimilars. So specifically, we're talking about generics, so we'll talk about the biosimilars. It depends on the protein structure and the stability of it, but certainly a lot of biosimilars can be manufactured using a continuous manufacturing process, and therefore reducing the lead times there as well. So there's a sort of a double whammy. This could very well revolutionize and separate the smaller generic manufacturers to the larger ones. So the earlier the adoption is, the higher the quality and the lower the cost of manufacturing becomes, and therefore the faster you can engage with other markets and undercut your prices, undercut other competitors. So certainly there's that aspect, and then the other aspect is you can react to shortages, which is I think every generic company's dream, is to react to shortages and take advantage of shortages within the market, because you can react faster to these. Importantly, we'll get the medicines to the patients faster and more sustainably and more accurately. So this is the two key areas for generic manufacturers. But again, I emphasize the same is also true for biosimilars as well. But it really does depend on the stability of the protein.
Great, thank you very much, Sam. So we have run over time. Apologies for that, everybody, but thank you for all of the huge amount of questions that we've received today. Thank you especially to our amazing speakers for taking part, Sarah, Dan, and Sam. Thank you for being here. And of course, thank you to everybody who joined us. You'll shortly receive a link to watch the video on demand. Please feel free to share this with anyone who was unable to join today. You'll also receive a survey in this email, and we'd be very grateful for your feedback on the event. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.